And so you know us at this point. Today, Danielle and I are going to cover a quick recap of step 3, and then we're really going to dive into step 4, which is when we're starting to think about the adaptation options and selecting adaptation actions. And then Danielle's going to cover some tips and tricks and key things to look out for as you're working on step 4 in the online adaptation workbook. And then we'll go over the homework and an assignment for next week, and then dive into a discussion about the challenges and opportunities that you worked on over the last week. And so just a quick recap from last week, we covered step 3, which is where we're really evaluating those management objectives and considering climate change. And this is the step where you're bringing together your management goals and objectives that you identified in step 1 and the climate impacts that you identified in step 2 to really start thinking about how climate change is going to affect your goals and objectives. And so in step 3 is where we're really weighing the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents to determine that feasibility of meeting your management goals and objectives under current management practices. And so this afternoon in the discussion, we really want to hear more about some of these challenges and opportunities that you came up with for your specific projects. And so today we're going to really get into step 4, which is where we're identifying the appropriate climate adaptation approaches and tactics or actions that help us respond to those climate-related challenges and local site conditions and the specific site vulnerabilities that climate change presents. And so in step 4, what we're going to use are these tools that we call adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. And so you can find these embedded within the online adaptation workbook, and they're also in chapters 3 and 4 of the Forest Adaptation Resources document, if anyone has been following along with that. And so basically what we call menus are menus or lists of possible actions that allow you to decide what is most relevant for a particular location and set of conditions. And so just like a menu at a restaurant, there's going to be a whole list and suite of options for you to choose from, but you don't necessarily want to pick everything off the menu because it's going to be too much. So these adaptation menus are really there to help you pick and choose different adaptation strategies and approaches that make the most sense for meeting your specific management goals and objectives, and that apply to your specific location or resource that you're trying to manage for. And so our menus really are a collection of different plausible adaptation actions that you can think about implementing on the ground. They're specific to different disciplines, so I'll cover what we have available, but we have a suite of menus for different resource areas. They're also organized into a tiered hierarchy, so they really start from some of those more broad concepts for adaptation and then dive down into more specific adaptation approaches. And then you, as individuals, will come up with your specific adaptation tactics or actions for your specific project. And Danielle will go into that a little bit more in her tips and tricks. And so, again, the key thing is that these menus really are thorough and comprehensive. They're pulled from all of the current science and research, and they're chosen and picked based on a large lit review that we've done of different adaptation strategies that are out there. And so there are opposing ideas on the menus, and so you really do have to pick and choose the ones that make the most sense based on the climate change impacts you are dealing with, and that still help you meet your goals and objectives. And so addressing the adaptation menus really are beneficial when it comes to addressing a lot of the challenges that we hear for implementing adaptation. And so again, they really help connect some of those broad ideas and those larger, broader goals that we have to deal with in management to specific actions on the ground, and really help us make our actions intentional. So really connecting the dots from those goals to the specific tactics or actions that we decide to implement for our projects. They also help communicate our ideas, and hopefully they boost creativity by giving you this suite of different adaptation strategies and approaches to choose from. And then, so these are some of the adaptation menus of strategies and approaches that are available in the online adaptation workbook. So you'll be able to pick from forestry, urban forestry, ag, and forested watersheds. Those lists are already embedded within the online platform that we have. However, we also have other menus available on our website at forestadaptation.org that I'd encourage you to check out, including tribal perspectives, forest carbon management, recreation, and non-forested wetlands. And then we're also in the process of preparing some other menus as well. And you can learn more about all of these on the website, including wildlife management, coastal ecosystems, grasslands, and wildland fire. And so I'm just going to briefly cover a spectrum of adaptation options for you to consider. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. We're actually going to ask you to watch a 30-minute video that covers these concepts in a little bit more detail. And these are big, lofty, kind of abstract ideas, but when we're thinking about adaptation, we like to think about it in terms of these broad adaptation options that cover this spectrum for us to consider when we're thinking about implementing those adaptation strategies and approaches. And so the first one is really this concept of resistance, where we're really trying to reduce impacts and maintain those current conditions on the ground. And so the resistance adaptation option, we're really thinking about how do we improve the defenses of our local ecosystem against change and disturbance, and then maintain relatively unchanged conditions on the ground. And so thinking about that at one end of the spectrum. Then in the middle, we have resilience, which is where we're really trying to accommodate some degree of change, but encouraging that return to a prior reference condition following a disturbance. And then at the other end of the spectrum is where we're really thinking about this transition adaptation option. So where we're intentionally facilitating change and really enabling our ecosystems to respond to those new and changing conditions. So we really want that transition adaptation option to be a little bit more forward thinking, where we're intentionally promoting or facilitating that change on the ground. And so when you're exploring those adaptation menus that are within the adaptation workbook, you might want to think about some different strategies and approaches that help you reduce your climate change impacts and maintain current conditions across this spectrum of adaptation options. So you might want some, depending on what your goals and objectives are, that really help maintain those unchanged conditions, but still help you adapt to those climate change impacts. Or you might actually want to think about something where you're really promoting that change and facilitating what that looks like on the ground, and something that looks more like this transition adaptation option. So just keep this spectrum of different ideas in mind as you're picking and choosing strategies and approaches from those adaptation menus. And as I mentioned, part of your homework is to please watch this video, which is going to dive into these concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition in a little bit more detail and help provide the background and potential adaptation pathways and tools that were used to come up with these ideas and help you really think about step 4 as you're going through the adaptation workbook. And so again, the menus and these concepts are really part of this logical train of thought to help connect the dots between our management goals and objectives all the way to those tactics or actions that we're implementing on the ground, and ultimately that monitoring plan to track and evaluate whether or not our actions were effective. But the key reason that this is important is so that we really have this clear thought process. We can document our intentionality in a management plan. And so when someone asks you why you decided to implement that tactic on the ground, you have this clear trail of thought documenting how you're addressing your management goals and objectives and dealing with some of those climate change impacts that are specific to your project location. And so one last thought, adaptation actions may not look that different from the current management actions that we're already implementing on the ground, especially in the near term. And so a lot of the actions that we choose to continue to implement under a changing climate just might become that much more important because of climate change. Some of those actions that we're implementing on the ground, we might want to make some small tweaks that just help improve their effectiveness. And then there might be a few different actions that you decide to implement that are really wild and crazy, and you're trying something completely new and different to see what it might do and help facilitate that transition to that future climate condition on the ground. And so in step 4 of the adaptation workbook, the key question we're really asking is what actions can enhance the ability of the project area to adapt to anticipated changes while still meeting our management goals and objectives. And so within the adaptation workbook itself, we're going to ask you to identify an adaptation approach where you're picking and choosing from those menus of options and picking any that seem to make sense that help address your climate change challenges that you talked about in step 3. And then we also want you to identify specific tactics or the specific actions that you can take that really detail what, where, and how you're going to implement the actions on your property. And so again, the approaches are a little bit more broad. They relate to a specific resource area and maybe a specific region, but those tactics are really going to be those key specific details that you come up with underneath those adaptation approaches to help you really narrow down on your thinking of what that looks like on the ground at your specific location. And then we also want you to specify your time frame. So when are you going to implement the tactics, whether it's going to be doing a harvest in the winter of 2021, or maybe within 3 years, you really want to start doing some planting, or maybe you need to do some site prep and then do some planting. All of those are different options you consider for specifying those time frames for your adaptation tactics. And then we also want you to think about what are some of the benefits. So why is the tactic good for your project location? So maybe it addresses some of the biggest and multiple challenges you're dealing with. It could be the cheapest and easiest option. Maybe there's a bunch of co-benefits. It might be more aesthetically pleasing. It might be more acceptable by the public. And it might also be the most likely to succeed. So really think about what are the benefits of some of the tactics you come up with. And then also what are some of the drawbacks and barriers. So why is this tactic not the best option? Maybe there's some negative side effects. Maybe there's a high cost or a lot of effort involved to implement that tactic on the ground. It might not actually be as successful as a different option, or maybe there's social, financial, or other barriers that you have to deal with when it comes to implementing that tactic as well. And then using all of that information, we want you to determine the practicability of your tactics. So is it both effective? Is it really going to meet your desired intent? And is it feasible? Is it really capable of being implemented on the ground? And so then you'll rate the practicability of your tactics from high to low, where high is yes, it's effective and it's feasible. Moderate is, well, it might take some additional effort or planning, but yes, we can still implement this on the ground. Or low, where no, maybe the barriers and drawbacks really are too big and the benefits are too small for that specific tactic. And then finally, will you recommend or not recommend that tactic given all of the barriers and benefits and drawbacks and different considerations for that action and being able to implement it on the ground? And if it's a yes, then look into integrating that into your plan or your prescription or your other activities. And if no, maybe it's not useful at this time, keep it in your back pocket for when it might be a different option in the future. But you still have your documented thought process of here are the benefits and here are the barriers and drawbacks of this action, so we're not going to implement it on the ground at this time. And so just to put this all into context and give you a different example, last week, Patricia covered a specific case study for urban forestry. This week, I want to dive into another urban floodplain forest example that has gone through the adaptation workbook process. And this site is actually a part of our Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change network. And so this is an experimental trial that is really looking at different actions for resistance, resilience, and transition on the ground. And so they've selected adaptation actions for all 3 of those different options and are actually coming up with an experiment to monitor which one works best and makes the most sense on the ground at Crosby Farm Regional Park. And so just a little bit more information. Crosby Farm is a part of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is a national park along the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities metro area of Minnesota in St. Paul. And so some of their management goals for this project were to really create that diverse stratified canopy. They really want natural regeneration that covers different age classes. They want to make sure that there's habitat for wildlife because it's a migratory flyway, and they also want to make sure that there's pollinator habitat. They want to ensure there's cottonwood regeneration, again, as that migratory flyway. And then they want to make sure that there's bluff trail restoration and they're reducing soil erosion, and then monitoring and removing invasive species at this site. And so since this is a part of an experimental trial, they're really looking at trying to maintain these goals and achieve these goals over the long term in 15 or 20 years into the future. And so some of the key climate change impacts Crosby Farm is dealing with, they are getting warmer temperatures, especially at night and in both the summer and the winter. They are getting more extreme heavy rain events and flooding, as you can see from that picture on the right. There's supposed to be a trail that goes straight through where all of that water is. There's more drought stress occurring in the summer, and they're also worried, the projections are that their hardiness zones are going to shift to either a 5 or a 6, which would create conditions that are similar to that of Omaha, Nebraska. They're dealing with extreme events, including the polar vortex that happened, I think it was last year, and extreme low temperatures in the winter. And then there's other invasive species considerations they're dealing with as well, including emerald ash borer. And so some of the key challenges and opportunities Crosby Farm thought about, the trees that are currently found in the park are mostly ash and elm, floodplain ash and elm, and they're expected to see reduced habitat suitability under climate change. And then some of those other species that are expected to see that reduced habitat suitability are northern white oak, black willow, silver maple, cottonwood, and box elder. And then the ash species are also declining due to the presence of emerald ash borer, and they're expected to largely disappear from the forest canopy. Some of the opportunities that Crosby Farm identified is that some of the trees are expected to have increased habitat suitability under climate change, including bur oak, swamp white oak, hackberry, elm, and mulberry. And then habitat suitability for honey locust, sycamore, and swamp white oak is also projected to increase. And those are currently found in similar floodplain forests in southern Minnesota and Iowa. And so there may be opportunities for planting some of those southern species at Crosby Farm. And so some of the adaptation approaches and tactics that they came up with, again, this is a part of this experimental trial. So they thought about ones for resistance, resilience, and transition. And so some of these might be conflicting ideas, but they're segmented into these experimental blocks at this site. And so one of the examples for resistance, which is where we're really trying to maintain that current condition on the ground, was to prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and remove existing invasive species. And so their specific actions to address that NIAC's adaptation approach from those menus was to do some site prep for natural regeneration and then do some planting and scout and treat and remove the invasive plant populations found on site. For resilience, which is allowing that bouncing back from disturbances, they chose the adaptation approach of favor or restore native species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And so their specific tactics were to incorporate genotypes of existing species that are adapted to those warmer temperatures that are expected, and to incorporate a broader range of flood-adapted species that are native to Minnesota and northern Iowa. So again, thinking about those southern species that are within that floodplain forest ecosystem. And then for their transition adaptation option, they chose to introduce species that are expected to be adapted to those future conditions. So again, they're expected to shift to a hardiness zone of a 5 or a 6 and have conditions similar to Omaha, Nebraska. So what the Crosby Farm folks started thinking about was to promote a broad suite of future climate adaptive species that are flood tolerant and drought tolerant, but that might be from seed zones farther south along the Mississippi River. And so they want to shift the species composition and these transition treatments to be something that's more similar to areas in southern Iowa and potentially Missouri. And so then some of their monitoring steps, which we'll cover in step 5 next week, are to really think about overstory measurements. So looking at what species are present in the overstory, the height and the health, etc. Measuring those seedlings and saplings, especially the ones that they're planting, to see their survival and their growth. And then monitoring that herbaceous layer. Is there down dead wood present, and then keeping track of that microclimate and the soils as well. And so that's just one example of one project that's used the adaptation workbook process and really thought about this suite from resistance, resilience, and transition to think about how they're picking and choosing their adaptation approaches and then the specific tactics that they want to implement on the ground. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Danielle.
Okay, let me get everything going. Are you seeing my screen, Courtney?
I see the, like just the normal PowerPoint layout, not the full expanded slide.
Oh no, that was perfect. Okay, that's what I wanted you to see. Okay, so thank you, Courtney. That was a great explanation of step 4. Just a reminder, you know, because we did cruise through this introduction, that you can find some more information within the adaptation workbook itself. If you download the PDF, you can read, you know, these explanations on a 2-page layout. There's lots of ways to find this information, but what we really want you to do, and you can find this in the Getting Started guide, is to start with that video. And that will start, you know, really opening up the creative mind to start thinking about where you are, you know, based on your goals, your objective, potential challenges, and site vulnerability. What's available to you? What kind of resistance, resilience, or transition options that do you have? Because although Courtney presented 3 ideas that fall within those adaptation options, it's not always apparent, or it's not always applicable to every project that you have the whole suite. Sometimes you're really pushed into resistance. Sometimes you're really, you have to look at transition. So start with the video and then look through the Getting Started guide to refresh on all the stuff that we talked about today. This pro tips, I'm going to go through it really quick. This is just to be some helpful guidance as you're thinking about doing this work in the adaptation workbook itself. So as Courtney mentioned, kicked off our session today talking about menus. There are several different topical areas that we work in that we've sort of combed through literature and helped to make those adaptation connections to those broad concepts. And we've created menus that really help to tell that story, and that might include some of the vocabulary of the work that you're already doing. So when you're in the workbook, you can quickly find the menus that we have embedded within the system using some of the shortcuts, and I'll show you what a screenshot of that looks like in a second. So you can sort of pop around and you can say, well, I work in forest, but my site also has some urban qualities and it's kind of a watershed. You can bounce around and you can start to see all of those menus. So definitely interact with them before you decide to integrate into the website your tactic. Just pop around, look at those menus and look at some of the example tactics. You can choose from any menu when you are structuring your step 4. You can say, I have a tactic that's squarely in forest management, but I have another tactic that's squarely in forested watershed management or agriculture, whatever it is. You can mix and match. And you can associate that tactic to any of your objectives. So you can say this one tactic is actually everything that I need to do. And so you can hit the box to associate them with all of your objectives. And then again, you can determine if you're going to proceed with those tactics or not. So I'm going to show you some screenshots. This is what step 4 looks like. So when you get there, you will be able to review your goals and your objectives, as you can see here. And you'll use that add a tactic, that orange box, to create your tactic. Before you do that, definitely go and click on the view menus and start to pop around and just to preview what each menu contains and see some example tactics to help orient yourself. Once you click the add a tactic box, you'll receive a pop-up box that actually takes up the entire screen, but I shrinked it down here. And this is where you get down to the nitty-gritty and you really start to spell out what are the details of that tactic, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, what are the time frame. And this is where you connect it to those strategies and approaches. Now, another way to find the menu is actually on the home page. So when you go to adaptationworkbook.org, if you click the Explore tab, you'll see a drop down. And this is where you can get at all of the innards of the adaptation workbook without being inside it. So this is where you find that Climate Impact Explorer tool, the resource library, and strategies and approaches. So that's another way to get to the menus. Once you have determined what tactic you will create and you've already done all the work to explain the benefits and the drawbacks, you'll get to the second half of step 4. You can see here on your menu bar, it says tactic recommendations. Well, automatically all of your tactics will be clicked for recommending. So in your plan, it'll say you recommend to do this plan. But for some of us, we might not recommend it because maybe there's a policy that's prohibiting us from taking this action. And so we can't, just legally, we wouldn't be able to take this action. Or maybe you just don't have the land yet, maybe you don't have the partnership buy-in, whatever it is. You might say, great idea, we're going to keep it on the table, but we're on the parking board, but we're not going to recommend it right now. So what we'll ask you to do is jot down a few ideas here so that when you return to this plan in a couple of months, you'll know why you didn't recommend it. Or maybe your coworkers can then also understand it if you share it widely. So lots to do in this step, but definitely use that Getting Started guide to orient yourself as you move through the step and start with that video. Lastly, each step, just a reminder, has a video on how to use the tool itself. And so you'll find the little embedded YouTube video at the top of every instructional panel. And you can use these carrots, these orange little half triangles, to move in and out of all of those screens. Your assignment for next time is to complete step 3 as needed. I know some folks are still working on it, and that's awesome. Totally get to work on that. Then move right into watching that video. Take some time, jot down some ideas before you go into the adaptation workbook itself and complete step 4. There's also a little homework that you'll need to complete as well. So go back to that Getting Started guide and find all of the links to all the materials that we talked about today, and that will help to orient you as you move into this step as well. But the really cool thing is you actually have not only this week to complete step 4, but next week as well. So we are having our vacation week, no class. Next week there will be no class, no discussion, and we're going to ask that over the next 2 weeks you sort of get yourself up to speed, get yourself all the way through step 4 and be ready for step 5 when class begins on Tuesday, July 20th. The lecture will talk about step 5, which is the last step of the adaptation workbook. And yeah, we just look forward to hearing from you this week and next. So if you haven't had a meeting with your instructor, or if you want to carry on those conversations and continue to get help, please reach out to us. We are here and available to you. So no class next week. One thing I wanted to show you, if I can find my mouse, is what, if you were to go to the home page, what you might find. So if you go to Explore, you're looking for menus, you click on Strategies and Approaches. You'll come to a home page that looks like this. You'll see that you can browse the menus. So I'm looking for urban. So you'll click it and you'll see the entire menu as it's written right there. You can read this as a high level. You could click one of the approaches and it'll take you right to the text. And then you can sort of read the paragraph, the supporting text that explains what that approach means. And most importantly, you'll start to see examples of how you could take that idea, that approach, and translate it into an on-the-ground action. And with the urban menu, we actually have split it out between developed urban sites and natural urban areas. You can see here there's urban natural areas and developed, but then there's also tactics that just apply squarely to all urban forest sites. So take a second to just pop around and see what we're offering at the adaptationworkbook.org. All right, so do we have any questions before our discussion session?